I can't marry someone who has nothing." The groom looked at his bride and walked away in front of everyone. The entire church froze. Sophia stood at the altar in complete shock. Her hands trembled. Guests started whispering. Some even pulled out their phones. A woman in the front row laughed quietly, and Ethan's mother smiled. Sophia's wedding dress was still stained from working double shifts all month to help pay for the ceremony. She had sold her jewelry, taken extra jobs, and skipped meals just to make Ethan happy. But none of it mattered. Then the church doors opened. A luxury black car pulled up outside, and a glamorous woman stepped out. She walked directly toward Ethan and kissed him in front of everyone. The guests gasped. Ethan smiled and said, "I'm marrying someone who matches my future." Sophia looked completely broken. But while everyone laughed at the abandoned bride, one elderly man near the back pew remained silent. He never took his eyes off Sophia. When she started crying, he slowly stood up. And suddenly, the entire church became quiet. The old man walked toward Sophia and gently held her hand. Then he turned toward Ethan. "You rejected her because she was poor," he smiled coldly. "That's interesting, because the woman you just humiliated is the sole heir to my family's estate." The church went silent. Ethan's face lost all color, and Sophia finally realized why the old man looked so familiar. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you are watching this from. We love hearing from you. And if you have not hit that subscribe button yet, do it right now, because what is coming next in this story is going to leave you absolutely speechless. Sophia Mercer did not grow up with safety nets. She grew up in a small apartment on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a radiator that banged through every winter like it was trying to escape the wall. Her mother, Clara, never used the word poor in that house, not once. She did not want her daughter carrying that word around like a verdict. Instead, she taught Sophia everything she needed to know through the way she moved through their life, with precision, with pride, and with a total refusal to be diminished by circumstances she had not chosen. Sophia absorbed every bit of it. She studied hard, earned a scholarship, worked her way through college, and landed a job as a content writer at a marketing firm in Columbus. She was sharp, focused, and quietly formidable in the way that people become when they have never once been handed anything. She sent money home to Clara every month before she paid her own bills. She lived simply and without complaint, and she was, by any honest measure, already someone remarkable, long before the church, long before Alexander Laurent, long before any of it. She met Ethan Caldwell at a rooftop party in the short north on a warm September evening, and the first thing that drew her to him was not his looks or his money, though he had both. It was the way he listened. He asked her real questions and sat with the actual answers, and he looked at her directly when she spoke. And in those early months, he made her feel seen in a way she had quietly been hungry for, without ever admitting it. He told her he admired people who built themselves from nothing. He told her money meant nothing compared to character. He said all the right things, and he said them convincingly. And Sophia, who had been raised by a woman who meant every word she said, heard them as truth. He proposed 14 months in, at a restaurant she had dreamed about from the sidewalk for years, and she said yes before he finished asking. She called Clara from the parking lot, still crying, and Clara said, "Oh, sweetheart," in a voice that carried something careful in it that Sophia, too full of joy to decode it, tucked away and forgot about until much later. The engagement was when the real Ethan Caldwell began to show himself, slowly, the way cold shows itself in autumn. Not all at once, but in degrees, each one individually survivable, all of them together something else entirely. His mother, Patricia, had opinions about the wedding that were not opinions so much as directives, and the wedding she envisioned cost between $30,000 and $40,000. The Caldwell family offered $10,000. The rest, it became quietly understood, would come from Sophia. Ethan never said this directly. He said they would figure it out, and then he became unavailable to figure it out. And Sophia understood what that meant. So she figured it out. She took on a second job, then a third. She freelanced every weekend. She picked up catering shifts on Friday evenings, serving at events whose elegance felt like a preview of the wedding she was bleeding herself to build. She cut her grocery budget to almost nothing, eating whatever was cheapest, going without on the nights there was not enough. She sold her jewelry, her grandmother's gold bracelet, pearl earrings she had bought herself as a graduation gift, and a small silver necklace that had been the first beautiful thing she ever purchased for herself with her very first real paycheck. She sold them at a pawn shop 2 towns over so no one she knew would see her. She stood at that counter and watched irreplaceable things become a number, and she took the number, and she deposited it, and she kept going. Ethan, during all of this, was growing colder. The attentiveness of the early months had faded into distraction, then distance, then something that felt less like a man under pressure and more like a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it. He canceled plans. He made small comments about her apartment and her salary and the circles she moved in, each one light enough to deny but heavy enough to land. He deferred constantly to his mother, whose quiet precision in making Sophia feel insufficient had been, from the first meeting, one of the most practiced performances Sophia had ever been subjected to. But Sophia told herself it was the stress of the wedding. She told herself it would pass. She had invested too much of herself in the future she was building to allow herself to look clearly at what the foundation was made of. So she worked harder, she held tighter, she told herself she was almost through. 2 days before the wedding, Ethan called her. His voice had a flatness to it she had never heard before. Not tiredness, not stress, but the administrative flatness of someone delivering a decision already made. He said he had been thinking about alignment. He said he had been spending time with someone who understood his world more naturally. She asked him to say it plainly. He said he wasn't sure he could go through with the wedding. She set her coffee cup down carefully because her hand was shaking and she did not want to drop it. She told him, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, that she had sold her grandmother's bracelet for this wedding, that she had worked herself down to nothing for this wedding, that she needed him to look at what he was doing and own it plainly. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped she understood, then he hung up. She stood in her kitchen in the morning light and felt the full weight of every sacrifice land on her at once, and she let it land, and she did not collapse, because collapsing was not who she was. And then she made a decision that, in the retelling, some people call a mistake, and that she would defend for the rest of her life as the truest thing she had ever done. She went to the wedding anyway, not because she believed he would change his mind. She went because she was Sophia Mercer, and Sophia Mercer did not disappear. She had paid for that wedding with her grandmother's bracelet and her pearl earrings and her skipped meals and her Friday nights and her entire dignity, and she was going to stand at that altar and make Ethan Caldwell look her in the eye in front of every person he had ever asked to witness his life, and she was going to make him own every inch of what he was choosing to do. She walked that aisle alone, chin up, roses steady, eyes forward, and every step of it was an act of war. She reached the altar. She looked at Ethan's face and saw nothing in it that she had hoped for, none of the recognition, none of the regret, just the careful blankness of a man who had already closed the file. And then he stepped forward, and in a voice loud enough for the backer to hear, he said, "I can't marry someone who has nothing." And he walked away. He walked past his mother's smile, down the aisle, and through the back doors of his own wedding. The church went silent, then the whispering started, then the phones came out, then the woman in the front row laughed. Then the church doors opened again, and the black car was at the curb, and Vanessa stepped out in her dress and walked directly to Ethan and kissed him in front of everyone, and he smiled and said he was marrying someone who matched his future. And the guests gasped, and some laughed, and some recorded, and Sophia stood at the altar with her white roses and her stained dress, and felt the tears come and could not stop them, and in 23 years of hard things she had never once cried in public, and now she was crying in front of 200 people, and the humiliation of it was so complete and so precise that it felt almost designed. And then from the back of the church, silence, a different kind of silence. The kind that arrives when something with real weight enters a room. An elderly man was standing in the last pew on the left. He had been there the entire time, still as furniture, and something about the quality of his stillness was now pulling the attention of the room the way gravity pulls water. He was old in the way certain men are old, deepened rather than diminished, every year adding something rather than taking it away. Silver hair, strong-lined face. Eyes the particular shade of gray that holds everything without giving anything away. He was looking at Sophia, only Sophia, with an expression she could not fully read except to feel that it contained recognition, not of her face, but of something behind it, something older and more essential. And when her tears came, he moved. He walked down the side aisle, slowly and without drama, and the whispering died in sections as he passed, and he came to the altar, and he stood before her, and he took her hand in both of his. His hands were large and warm and absolutely steady, and Sophia, who had been holding herself upright by force of will alone all morning, felt something give slightly in her chest. He held her hand the way you hold something that matters. Then he turned toward the back of the church and found Ethan's eyes and said in a voice that carried without effort, "You rejected her because she was poor?" He let it sit. He let every person in that room feel the weight of it. Then he smiled, cold, precise, the smile of a man who has been waiting a long time to say the next thing and intends to say it exactly right. "That's interesting," he said, "because the woman you just humiliated is the sole heir to my family's estate." And the church went so completely silent that the candles on the altar could be heard burning. His name was Alexander Laurent. Sophia did not know that name yet. She did not know, standing at that altar with her hand in his, that the man holding it had spent 30 years looking for her mother. She did not know that her mother, Clara, had been born into one of the oldest and wealthiest families in New Orleans. She did not know that Clara had walked away from all of it at 23 for love when her father gave her an ultimatum that no woman of her character could accept. Choose the family's money and approval, or choose the man she loved and leave. Clara had chosen love. She had walked through an airport security line without looking back, because looking back was not who Clara was, and Alexander Laurent had stood at the departure gate and watched her go, and had been trying to find his way back to her ever since. Clara had a daughter. That daughter was Sophia. And the Laurent family estate, the properties, the portfolio, the trust, everything accumulated across 3 generations of one of Louisiana's most quietly powerful families, belonged to Clara, and through Clara, to Sophia. It had always belonged to her. She simply had not known it existed. Alexander led her out through the side door of the church before the room could fully reassemble itself. Danielle followed without being asked. Clara met them in the hallway, and when she saw Alexander she stopped walking, and 30 years fell away in the space of a breath. And she put her hand over her mouth, and the man who had cried at her departure gate said her name. Just her name, and Clara Mercer, who had built her entire life on the principle of not breaking in front of anyone, broke, just slightly, just enough. They went to a quiet restaurant nearby, the 4 of them, and Alexander told the whole story from the beginning, the way it deserved to be told. Clara's father, the ultimatum, the airport, the letters that never arrived, the decades of searching, the newspaper photograph that had finally, after 30 years, led him back. He told them about the estate. He told them about the trust. He told them what it meant. Clara listened with her hands folded on the table, and when he finished, she said, "I didn't leave for the money, Alexander." He said, "I know." She said, "I don't need saving." He said, "I know that better than anyone." He said he wasn't there to save her. He was there because what had been taken from her was hers, and it was time for it to be returned. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You look old." He said, "So do you." And they both laughed, genuinely and unexpectedly, and the pressure in the room broke open like weather. Sophia did not say much through all of this. She sat and listened and felt the architecture of her own life being rebuilt around her in real time. She had known herself as a woman with nothing, and she had built herself entirely from that knowledge. The resourcefulness, the discipline, the pride, the refusal to be diminished. And all of that was still true, was still entirely hers, and none of it was being taken from her. But something was being added, depth, roots, a line that went further back than she had known, and held more weight than she had imagined. She was not becoming someone else. She was discovering that the person she had already made herself was in fact exactly who the Laurent name had always produced. Women who did not fold, women who did not disappear, women who stood at altars in stained dresses and held their chin up when the world laughed. She had been a Laurent her whole life. She just hadn't known what to call it. The legal process of transferring and formalizing the inheritance took several months, as these things do. Alexander's attorney, a meticulous New Orleans lawyer named Gerald Fontenot, worked alongside a Columbus firm to build the documentation chain, and Sophia worked with her own attorney, a sharp woman named Rachel Torres, who moved through the complexity with the same precision she brought to everything. During those months, Alexander came to Columbus 3 times. He had dinner with Sophia and Clara. He walked with Sophia through Goodale Park one afternoon and answered every question she had been saving. All of them, without deflection, without performance. He told her about the family. He told her about the estate, 3 significant properties in Louisiana, a commercial real estate portfolio that had grown substantially across 3 decades, and liquid assets that made the numbers on the trust document feel unreal the first time Sophia read them. He told her that the way the Laurent family had always grown their wealth was through real estate, that it was in the blood of the family, the instinct for it, the ability to look at a property or a market or a moment and see not what it was but what it could become. He said he had seen that instinct in the way she asked questions, in the way she listened, in the way she looked at things. He said that with the right foundation and the right mentorship, there was nothing in this industry she could not build. Sophia listened to all of this and said very little because she was already quietly beginning to think. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment when her lease ended. She set up one room as an office. She spent the first 3 months after the inheritance was formalized doing nothing but learning, reading everything she could find on commercial real estate, sitting in on meetings with Alexander's team in New Orleans on video call, studying the Laurent portfolio with the same focused intensity she had brought to every exam she had ever sat. She had always been a person who understood things quickly when she chose to understand them, and she chose, now, to understand this completely. She flew to New Orleans twice during that period and spent days walking properties with Gerald Fontenot and Alexander's development team, asking questions that the team initially treated with polite patience and eventually began to treat with something closer to genuine respect. She had an eye, not just for what a building was worth on paper, but for the human dimension of it. The neighborhood story, the trajectory, the gap between what a space communicated and what it could communicate with different choices. She saw things other people walked past, and she was fast. Decisions that took other people days to arrive at took her hours, not because she was reckless, but because she was thorough in the preparation and clean in the execution, and she had spent her entire life making quick decisions under pressure with limited resources, which turned out to be, in real estate development, exactly the skill that separated the people who built empires from the people who built portfolios. Within 8 months of the inheritance being formalized, Sophia had founded Laurent Mercer Properties. The name was deliberate, both names, both histories, the inheritance and the making of herself. She established the company in Columbus, but with the full backing of the Laurent estate's financial weight behind it. And from the first day it operated at a level that the Columbus real estate market had not previously seen from a company that young. She moved fast but not carelessly. She identified 3 undervalued commercial properties in neighborhoods whose trajectories she had studied for months, acquired them in rapid succession, and began development on all 3 simultaneously with a project management intensity that made her team, which she had recruited from the top of the market, work harder than they had worked for anyone. She had a quality that is genuinely rare in this industry. She could look at a building and feel its potential before the numbers confirmed it, and she was almost never wrong. And the market began to notice this with the particular alertness of an industry that respects results above everything else. Alexander watched all of this from a careful distance, close enough to advise when asked, and far enough to allow her to build without interference. He had mentored people before, but never quite like this. Never someone who absorbed so completely, who built so naturally, who needed direction so rarely and execution so seldom. He said once, over dinner in New Orleans, that he had spent his career looking for people who understood that real estate was not primarily about buildings. It was about reading the future correctly before other people could see it. He said Sophia had that ability in a way he had only encountered twice before in 40 years of business, and he said it not to flatter her, but because it was accurate. And Alexander Laurent did not say inaccurate things. She thanked him and immediately asked him 3 technical questions about zoning legislation in Ohio, because that was who she was. And he answered all 3, and they kept working. And the dinner lasted 4 hours and felt like 20 minutes. It was at one of Alexander's dinners in New Orleans, about 14 months after the wedding, that she met Marcus Hale. He was not someone who announced himself. He was already in the room when she arrived, standing near the window with a glass of red wine, talking to two men she recognized from Alexander's extended circle, unhurried in the way of people who have nowhere more important to be and know it. He was perhaps 40, handsome in the way of men who have never organized their lives around being handsome, with the particular kind of ease that comes not from money alone, but from having moved through enough of the world to have stopped being impressed by most of it. Alexander introduced them. Marcus Hale, he said, was one of the most respected names in Southern commercial development, had built a portfolio that stretched from New Orleans to Atlanta to Nashville, and had a reputation for being the person in the room whose opinion changed the outcome of things. He shook her hand and said he had heard about Laurent Mercer Properties and had been following it with interest. Sophia said she was glad someone was paying attention. He smiled, something shifting in his eyes. He said, "Everyone is paying attention. You just haven't noticed yet." They talked for 3 hours at that dinner and barely spoke to anyone else, which Alexander noticed and said nothing about, which was itself a form of comment. Marcus was brilliant in the way that people are brilliant when intelligence has been shaped by experience rather than just education. He understood not only how markets worked but why they worked, the human and social mechanics beneath the numbers, and he spoke about development the way Sophia had only ever heard Alexander speak about it, as a discipline with moral weight, as a responsibility to the communities a building enters, not just a transaction. She found herself disagreeing with him twice in that conversation, and pressing the disagreement rather than smoothing it over. And both times he leaned forward slightly and engaged the pushback directly and seriously, and by the end of the second disagreement, she had revised one of her positions and held firm on the other, and he had said, "Good," with a quiet satisfaction that was entirely genuine. She drove back to her hotel that night with a feeling she had not had in a long time, the feeling of having been seen. Not managed, not assessed, not measured against a standard she had not set, seen. They began speaking regularly after that dinner. First professionally, he had contacts in the Nashville market she was beginning to look at, and she had insights into the Columbus market that he found genuinely useful. And then, more personally, with the natural ease of two people who have recognized something in each other and are in no particular rush about what to do with that recognition. Marcus was not a man who moved fast in matters that mattered to him. He was patient and precise and consistently himself, and Sophia, who had been in a relationship with a man who performed consistency while practicing its opposite, valued the real version of it with a new and specific appreciation. He asked about her work more than he talked about his own. He remembered things she mentioned in passing. He showed up in the ways that mattered without being asked and without making it a performance. She told Danielle about him on a call one evening, and Danielle said, "You sound different when you talk about him." Sophia said, "Different how?" Danielle said, "Like you're not holding your breath." Sophia was quiet for a moment and then said, "Yeah." She said it quietly, like something she was just now allowing herself to notice. Their relationship developed alongside her business, which felt right to her. Two things growing in parallel rather than one consuming the other. Marcus had his world and she had hers, and when they came together, it was as two people who chose each other from positions of strength, which was the only kind of choosing Sophia was any longer interested in doing. He was wealthy, respected, known in every room that mattered across 4 states, and Sophia was richer than him, which was a fact she registered not with satisfaction but with a quiet certainty. This was not a relationship in which she was the one making sacrifices to keep up. This was something balanced and real, and built on a foundation that had been tested before it was trusted. She did not rush it, and she did not need to. She had learned, in the most public and thorough way possible, what it cost to pour yourself into something that could not hold the weight. She was not making that mistake again. While Sophia's world was expanding in every direction, Ethan Caldwell's was doing something quite different. It was contracting. Not all at once. The particular cruelty of what happened to Ethan was that it happened slowly, in stages, each one leaving him just enough ground to stand on that he could not yet fully admit how much he had already lost. The first stage was the video. He had not anticipated how far it would travel, how long it would stay, how thoroughly it would redefine the way people understood who he was. He had made a calculation that the people who mattered in his world would understand what he had done, would read it as a man making a pragmatic choice rather than a cruel one, and would move on. What he had not accounted for was that the people who mattered in his world were also the people who did business with his family's firm, and those people had their own calculations to make. And the calculation increasingly was that association with the Caldwell name was a liability that outweighed its usefulness. Ethan had placed Vanessa in a senior role at Caldwell Commercial Properties within 2 months of the wedding. He had presented it as a strategic hire, a way to bring in connections and credibility through her network. What it was in practice was a man giving a position of significant authority to someone he was romantically involved with and whose qualifications for the role were not remotely commensurate with its responsibilities. Vanessa understood luxury and social capital. She did not understand commercial real estate development. She made decisions with the confidence of someone who has always moved through rooms that deferred to her. And the results were, within 6 months, immeasurably damaging. Deals were pitched to the wrong partners. A significant development project in the short north was mismanaged from the first site meeting, with cost overruns that bled into the firm's already fragile operating margins. 2 of the firm's most experienced brokers resigned within 3 months of Vanessa's appointment, both citing in their exit interviews concerns about the direction of leadership. Ethan was not present enough in the operational details to catch these things early, and by the time the damage was visible, it had already compounded into something that a good quarter could not fix. His father, Richard Caldwell, was in semi-retirement by this point, and was watching from a distance with the particular anguish of a man who has spent 40 years building something, and as watching his son dismantle it with the casual efficiency of someone who has never fully understood what it cost to build. He said things to Ethan, carefully, in the language of fathers who are trying not to destroy a relationship while saving a company, and Ethan heard the words and did not receive them, because Ethan had spent his entire life understanding his father's caution as a form of smallness rather than a form of wisdom. He believed things would stabilize. He believed Vanessa would find her footing. He believed the video would fade, the business would recover, and that the life he had chosen would prove itself correct. He believed all of this with the specific stubborn conviction of a man who has confused wanting something to be true with evidence of its truth. The business did not stabilize. The third quarter came in with numbers that the firm's remaining senior staff presented to Ethan in a conference room on a rainy Tuesday morning, with the carefully neutral expressions of people delivering news they know will not be received well. 2 more deals fell through. A bank that had been a long-standing lender to the firm requested a review of its existing facilities. A commercial property in Dublin that had been a reliable earner in the portfolio began showing vacancy rates that, combined with the operating losses elsewhere, created a cash flow picture that was genuinely difficult to explain away. Ethan sat at the head of that conference room table and listened to the numbers and felt, for the first time, something he was not accustomed to feeling. He felt afraid. Not the surface-level anxiety of a bad month, but the deeper fear of a man who is beginning to understand that the floor beneath him is not as solid as he has always assumed. He left the meeting and called Vanessa, and she talked for 15 minutes about a property she had seen in Miami that she thought they should look at, and he sat in his car in the parking garage and listened to her voice and felt the fear shift into something else. Something he did not have a name for yet. Something that was going to take a little longer to fully arrive. Meanwhile, in Columbus and New Orleans and Nashville, and an expanding number of markets that were beginning to pay close and serious attention, Laurent Mercer Properties was doing what happens when genuine talent meets real capital meets absolute determination. Sophia's company was not yet 2 years old, and it was already being written about in industry publications in terms that were unusual for a firm of its age. She had acquired 9 commercial properties across 3 states, developed 6 of them to completion, and turned 3 of those 6 into assets that had appreciated so significantly that the numbers, when placed next to the company's founding date, required the reader to go back and verify them. She had a team of 14 people who worked with her rather than for her, who had been recruited because they were the best available, and who stayed because being around Sophia Mercer made them better at what they did. She had a discipline in her acquisition strategy that people in the industry recognized as rare. She did not chase markets. She read them. and she read them not from data alone, but from the same quality of attention she had always brought to everything, the attention of someone who grew up with nothing and learned to see potential where other people saw only what was currently present. The skill that set her apart, the thing that was genuinely hers, unreplicable, the engine of everything, was her ability to see a neighborhood before it became what it was going to become. She did not follow gentrification. She anticipated it, but more than that, she shaped it, because she understood that the difference between a developer who extracts value from a community and one who creates it was not just ethical but strategic. Communities that felt ownership in their transformation grew faster and more sustainably than communities that felt invaded. She brought this philosophy to every project. She met with neighborhood associations before she submitted permit applications. She designed spaces that served the people already living there as well as the people her development would attract. She hired locally where she could and talked publicly about why. The result was not only buildings that performed well financially, but a reputation that preceded her into every room and every market she entered, the reputation of someone who could be trusted, which in real estate is worth more than any single property. Alexander watched all of this with a pride he expressed only in the quality of his attention, which was constant and complete. He had introduced her to the right people and opened the right doors, and then stepped back. Because stepping back was what she needed, and he understood that. He had mentored her in the specific way that good mentors mentor, not by telling her what to do, but by asking the questions that led her to discover what she already knew. Marcus had become a significant figure in her life by now, and Alexander had dinner with the two of them in New Orleans one evening and watched them talk about a development project they were both consulting on and felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt that the family was being restored, not the family of the house and the properties and the trust, the family in the real sense, the human sense, the sense of people who belong to each other by something more than inheritance. Clara came to New Orleans in April as she had promised, and stood in the garden among Alexander's gardenias and was quiet for a long time, and Alexander stood beside her and did not speak, and the 30 years of absence sat between them, and then, slowly, it did not. Some distances close differently than others. Some of them close not with a conversation but with a morning in a garden in April with gardenias and old oak trees and 30 years turned, somehow into something you can stand inside without pain. Sophia was in a meeting in Nashville when her phone lit up with a name she had not seen in over a year. Ethan Caldwell. She looked at the name on the screen for a moment, then turned the phone face down on the conference table and finished the meeting. She did not call back that day. She did not call back the next day either. When she finally listened to the voicemail, 3 days later, it was brief and strange, and carried in its brevity the specific quality of a man who has exhausted his options and is trying to present the asking of a favor as something more dignified than it is. He said Caldwell Commercial Properties was going through a restructuring. He said there might be an opportunity for collaboration. He said he thought of her when the situation came up and hoped there were no hard feelings. She listened to the message twice, and then she called Rachel Torres. She said, "Tell me everything about Caldwell Commercial Properties, the real numbers." Everything. Rachel said she would have a full picture within 48 hours. She did. The picture was not pretty. Caldwell Commercial Properties had been struggling for 2 years, and the last 12 months had been the most damaging. The Short North development project that Vanessa had mismanaged had become a near total loss, with the firm exposed to a cost overrun of nearly $4 million that it did not have the liquidity to absorb cleanly. The bank had tightened its facilities. 2 major clients had quietly moved their business elsewhere. The firm's remaining productive assets, 3 commercial properties in Columbus and 1 in Dublin, were generating enough revenue to keep the lights on but not enough to service the accumulated debt at its current level. The firm needed either a significant cash injection or a buyer. Ethan had called Sophia because Sophia was, at this point, the only person in his extended professional circle who was both capable of the transaction and, based on his calculation, potentially sentimental enough to do it charitably. He had looked at his situation and concluded that the woman he had abandoned at the altar, now the head of a rapidly ascending real estate company, was his best remaining option. The irony of this conclusion was either completely invisible to him or he had decided that surviving required him to ignore it. Sophia was not sentimental. She was also not cruel. She looked at the numbers, and she made the decision she would have made about any acquisition, which was to ask whether the assets were worth acquiring at the right price and under the right terms. The answer was yes. 3 of Caldwell's 4 properties were in locations she had been watching for her own expansion anyway. The Dublin property was underperforming in the current management's hands but had potential that, with Laurent Mercer's approach, was straightforward to realize. The acquisition made sense strategically, it made sense financially. And it was going to happen regardless of who it belonged to, because at the rate Caldwell was deteriorating, someone was going to buy it. The question was only who. Sophia decided the answer was her. She instructed Rachel Torres to begin the acquisition process. She told her to be fair and professional in every interaction. She told her to make no reference in any communication to the history between the 2 parties. She told her to proceed as she would with any transaction of this type, with one additional instruction. The acquisition was to be completed quietly, without press, without announcement, and Ethan Caldwell was to be informed of the final buyer only when the paperwork was ready to sign. The paperwork was ready on a Thursday morning in late October, about 20 months after the wedding. Rachel Torres sent the documents to Caldwell's attorney the evening before and confirmed the signing meeting for 10 o'clock. Ethan arrived with his attorney and his father, who had insisted on being present, and he sat down at the conference table and opened the document to the signature page and saw, for the first time, the name of the acquiring party. Laurent Mercer Properties. He looked at it for a moment. His attorney said something to him quietly. Richard Caldwell, who was sitting 2 chairs down, put on his reading glasses and looked at the page and was very still. Sophia was not in the room. She was in Nashville in a meeting that had nothing to do with Ethan Caldwell, because her life had nothing to do with Ethan Caldwell, and it had not for a long time. She had sent Rachel in her place with full authority to complete the transaction. The documents were signed, the assets were transferred. Caldwell Commercial Properties, in all its functional remaining parts, became a subsidiary of Laurent Mercer Properties on a Thursday morning in late October with no fanfare and no audience. Ethan signed his name and set the pen down and sat for a moment looking at the table. And what was on his face was not, by any account, the expression of a man who had come to terms with something. It was the expression of a man understanding something for the first time that he should have understood a long time ago. The understanding came too late for anything useful. It always does in stories like this, because the people who most need to understand things are usually the last to arrive at them. Vanessa had been watching the deterioration of Caldwell's business for months and had been conducting her own assessment of the situation with the same strategic clarity she had always brought to her decisions. The Ethan she had attached herself to, ascending, connected, the face of a family firm with standing, had been replaced, month by a different version. Broke was the word the industry was now using, quietly but consistently. A man whose company had been acquired by the woman he had publicly humiliated at the altar. A man whose name, when searched online, produced a viral video before it produced anything professional. A man whose family's reputation in Columbus had been quietly and thoroughly revised. This was not someone Vanessa had any further use for. She did not have a dramatic departure. She did not make a scene. She simply redirected herself, the way water redirects when it finds a lower path, toward other arrangements she had been cultivating with the appropriate foresight of someone who never fully bet on a single outcome. She was gone before Ethan had finished processing the acquisition. There was no conversation. There was only a series of unanswered calls, and then the particular silence that follows when someone who was a fixture in your life has decided, without announcement, that you no longer exist. Ethan spent the winter in a version of his life that was unrecognizable to the person he had been 2 years earlier. The house in Dublin was under refinancing. The professional network that had always been available to him, the calls returned, the doors open, the easy access of a man with a family name and a business card, had developed a new temperature, a new hesitancy, the hesitancy of people who are recalculating risk and finding the Caldwell name on the wrong side of the ledger. He called Brandon once, the friend from finance, who had always made him feel the particular warmth of belonging, and the call was returned 2 days later with an excuse that was polite and unconvincing and absolute. He sat in the house that was being refinanced and thought about the things he had said and done and chosen. And he thought about them the way you think about a series of decisions when their consequences have become fully visible, with the grinding specificity of regret that has nowhere to go because the window for using it productively has closed. He thought about Sophia at the altar. He thought about her stained dress and her shaking hands and the white roses. He thought about what Alexander Laurent had said in that church, and he thought about the signed documents on the conference table, and he thought, she built that. She built all of that, from nothing that was not nothing, from everything I told her she didn't have. He was not a villain in the operatic sense. He was something more ordinary, and in some ways worse, a man who had looked at something extraordinary and called it insufficient because he lacked the depth to see what he was looking at. He had measured Sophia against a set of values that were his mother's values, his circle's values. Values borrowed from people who had built their identities around the performance of wealth and had confused the performance with the thing itself. He had taken those borrowed values and applied them to a woman who had been building the real thing her entire life, brick by careful brick, under a lamp that buzzed in a kitchen that was always clean, and he had called it nothing, and walked away, and was now living inside the consequences of that assessment. The consequences were not dramatic. They were not a single crash, a public humiliation in a church. They were the slow, grinding, daily experience of a man whose life had narrowed in every direction simultaneously, who still got up every morning and made coffee and answered emails and told himself things would improve, and for whom improvement moved in only one direction, which was away. Sophia did not follow his situation closely. She did not need to. She had a company to run, and it was the kind of company that required her full attention because it was growing in ways that demanded it. Laurent Mercer Properties crossed a threshold in its second full year of operation that put it in a conversation about the most significant commercial real estate development firms in the Midwest, and that conversation was not aspirational but factual, supported by numbers that the industry tracked and verified. She was 30 years old. She had founded her company at 28 with an inheritance she had not known about until the morning of her abandoned wedding, and she had turned it into the #1 emerging real estate company in the region in less than 2 years, because she had a skill no school had taught her and no inheritance had given her, a skill she had built from 28 years of looking at hard things clearly and deciding what they were actually worth. She was named to a prominent industry list that year as one of the most influential figures in commercial development under 35. And the profile piece that accompanied the listing described her, in language that she found both accurate and slightly surreal, as a developer whose instinct for undervalued potential appears to operate on a frequency most of the industry cannot access. She read it twice and then sent it to Clara, who called her and cried, and Sophia laughed at her mother crying and then cried a little herself, and neither of them made anything of it. Marcus was in Columbus when the profile ran. He had been spending more time there as their relationship deepened, finding reasons to be in the same city that required less and less justification as time passed. He was not a man who needed to be the most important person in a room, which was itself a quality Sophia had come to understand was rarer than it should have been. He had his own empire, his own reputation, his own demands on his time, and he brought all of that into their relationship without asking her to make room for it by making less room for herself. They talked about deals over dinner and about everything else after dinner, and the distinction between the two categories was increasingly unclear in the best possible way, the way that happens when you are with someone whose whole life you find genuinely interesting. He told her once, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch of a property she had just acquired in Nashville that was not yet developed and that she had taken him to see because she wanted him to see it the way she saw it before, with all its potential still ahead of it. He told her that watching her build was the most interesting thing he had witnessed in a professional life that had not been short on interesting things. She said nothing for a moment, looking out at the property in the evening light. Then she said, "I'm just doing what I always did. I just have more to do it with now," he said. "That's exactly what I mean." She looked at him. He looked at her. The Nashville evening was warm and the property was full of potential, and the future was in every direction and entirely open. And she felt, Not for the first time, but more completely than ever before, that she had arrived somewhere she had been building toward her whole life without knowing it had a name. The Laurent estate, under Sophia's management in consultation with Alexander, grew in the year after the acquisition. She brought to its existing portfolio the same discipline and instinct she had applied to Laurent Mercer, identifying properties that had been underperforming under conservative management and repositioning them with a speed and precision that produced results Alexander's team began referring to, with a mixture of admiration and genuine surprise, as the Mercer effect. She was not interested in the title of heir. She was not interested in being defined by what she had inherited. She was interested in what she could build with it, and the difference between those two things was everything to her. She was a Laurent, and she was a Mercer, and she was the woman from the east side of Columbus who had read every book in the library and sold her grandmother's bracelet and stood at an altar in a stained dress without disappearing. And all of those things were simultaneously and equally true, and she held them all, and none of them canceled the others out. She had been told she was nothing. She had turned out to be everything, not because of the inheritance, because of who she had always been and who she kept choosing to be and what she built, steadily, honestly, without shortcuts, with her whole self, every single day. Clara retired from home health work that spring, not because Sophia pressured her, but because she was ready, and because for the first time in 30 years she had the space to be ready. She spent more time in her garden. She visited New Orleans twice and stood in the garden with Alexander among the gardenias and talked for hours, restoring 30 years of silence in the particular way that people who love each other restore silences, not all at once, but conversation by conversation, afternoon by afternoon, until the silence itself is no longer the thing that defines the space between them. She was by every measure happy. Not the performed happiness of someone who has decided to be positive, the real kind. The quiet, grounded, undramatic kind that comes when a life has finally arrived at a configuration that fits the person living it. Ethan Caldwell is still in Columbus. He is running something smaller now, a property management company modest in scope, serving clients whose names do not appear in any of the publications that cover the industry Sophia operates in. He is not destitute, he is not destroyed. He is simply diminished, reduced to the size of the life available to someone who made the choices he made, and is now living inside their full consequences. He sees the Laurent Mercer name in the industry press. He sees it more and more often, which is the nature of a company on the trajectory Sophia's is on, and he cannot avoid it because it is everywhere in the world he used to occupy and has now lost access to. He does not call again. He already knows there is no version of that call that ends well. He knows, in the way that people eventually know things they have spent a long time refusing to know, that what he called nothing was the most substantial thing he ever had access to, and that he looked at it and could not see it, and that the inability to see it was not a mistake he made, but a revelation of who he was. He lives with that. Every day he lives with it, quietly, without an audience, which is the particular quality of the kind of consequence he earned. Not the public crash, not the viral humiliation in a church, but something smaller and more permanent, the slow daily knowledge of exactly what he threw away and exactly why. That is his life now. That is what he built. And Sophia built something else entirely. She built a company that was #1 in its category before she turned 31. She built a relationship with a man who saw her clearly and chose her from a position of strength that matched her own. She built a friendship with an old man in New Orleans who had spent 30 years looking for her family and found them at an altar in Columbus on the worst morning of her life. She built something with her mother that was deeper than before, not the relationship of a daughter and a mother surviving together, but the relationship of two Sioux women who had each, in their own way and at their own cost, chosen integrity over comfort, and were now, finally, in a position to rest inside that choice. She built all of this from the same material she had always built from, herself, her precision, her refusal, her absolute unshakable knowledge of what she was worth, which had never been available for external assignment, and which Ethan Caldwell's assessment had not touched, not for 1 second, not even at the worst moment of the worst morning, because it was hers, built brick by brick from a young age in a kitchen in Columbus under a lamp that buzzed, and it was the only foundation she had ever needed, and it had never once failed to hold. This is not a story about revenge. It was never a story about revenge. Revenge requires a calculation, a deliberate engineering of someone else's downfall. And Sophia Mercer was never interested in engineering anything that was not constructive. What happened to Ethan Caldwell was not something she did to him. It was something he did to himself and then lived inside, and it happened slowly and without drama because that is how real consequences work. Not in a single cinematic moment, but in the daily accumulation of what you built and what you failed to build, and what you chose and what those choices cost. And what happened to Sophia was not a fairy tale. It was not the universe correcting an injustice with a magical inheritance and a billionaire's approval. It was a woman who had built herself completely from the ground up, discovering that the ground went deeper than she knew, and then doing what she had always done, building on it, faithfully, skillfully, without stopping, until what she had made was undeniable. That is the whole story. That is all of it. And every single word of it is exactly what she deserved.